the Ukraine with a history of fascism. But a figure that is most associated with this movement, Stefan Bandera, is the hero of the Svoboda, or so-called Freedom Party, which is regarded by a number of international organizations, including Jewish organizations, as a neo-Nazi party. There seems to be little doubt about its Nazi sympathies, and we could go into detail about that. But this accusation of an active fascist movement in Ukraine is in that historical context. And the Russians state that the group called the Right Sector, which is sort of the brown shirts that are loosely associated with the Svoboda Party, but organizationally separate, and now there's discussion about them becoming a political party, a different sort of political party as well. But according to the Russian description, members of the Right Sector, masked men, seized buildings, fired upon the crowd in Maidan with the intention of creating chaos and the possibility of seizing power. Probably Russian security forces leaked that clip from a conversation between the European Union foreign minister and the foreign minister of Estonia, in which the latter mentioned seeing that it was members of the opposition, that is the anti-Yanukovych forces, firing on the crowd, and she acknowledges it in the conversation. So the Russian view is the new regime brought to power in this way is illegitimate, and also they note it was handpicked by Washington. No one has mentioned yet the Newland conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, in which they're talking about who should succeed Yanukovych, and she is suggesting Yatsenyov, the present figure. The U.S. ambassador mentions Klitschko, Viktor Klitschko, who was another possibility favored by some in the EU, and that's when she famously says, "Fuck the EU," because he's not prepared yet, he needs more time to do his homework. And well, it turns out that when the new government is appointed by the post-coup regime, he is the one at the top of it. The Russians point out that the new government wastes no time in rescinding the language rights of Russian speakers in the country and canceling the status of Russian as an equal official language. This is extremely important in a country in which about 40% of the people speak Russian as their native language. And in this country, we think about identity as associated with visual racial markers and with gender and sexuality, but in a country like Ukraine, a lot of identity has to do with language. And Ukrainian and Russian are not mutually intelligible. They're like Spanish and Italian. So if you're suddenly told as a Russian you have to represent yourself in court in Ukrainian, it is a major problem. I don't think the U.S. press is giving adequate attention to the alienation felt by people denied their historical language rights. And so, thus, in various areas of the country, dissent emerged without any necessity for Russian agitation. The Russian narrative also includes a lot of detail about anti-Semitism in the new forces, anti-Russian sentiment, and so on. So these are the, and also, of course, the narrative continues to conclude that the people of Crimea, of their own free will, demanded to be reassociated with Russia, and Russia accommodatingly allowed them. So it's diametrically opposite to what we're getting in our news. Neither of these narratives necessarily go into the complexities of the fact that Yanukovych had, and the preceding regimes had all negotiated with EU as well as with Russia. There was never this real clear choice posed between either Europe or Russia. This is kind of a false dichotomy which Victoria Nuland was emphasizing, just as Putin was saying Ukraine can be a bridge between East and West in a Eurasian economy. Well, skipping over some stuff that I think is probably redundant, I want to go way back to the historical question of who are the Ukrainians and what does this have to do with the contemporary situation. Actually, Ukraine is extremely complicated. It's not simply a matter of Ukrainians in the West and Russians in the East. But this is a region that has been populated historically by lots of different peoples, by the Scythians, a type of Iranian people, Celts, Goths before the Slavs. For a time, the Central Asian Turkish people called the Khazars established an empire extending throughout most of Ukraine in the 7th century. Its ruling elite embraced Judaism. It's a very, very interesting situation. Jews from Byzantium went to Ukraine, intermarried with Khazars. This seems to be a large portion of the Ashkenazi gene pool, but that's part of Ukrainian history. Then Kievan Rus was established. So the first Russian state was centered around Kiev, which of course now is the chief city in Ukraine. But these were a people of mixed Viking, Swedish, and Slavic origins. They eventually seem to destroy the Khazar state, but then the state divides into its component parts, one of which, from 1199 to 1340, is really the only independent Polish state that we find before modern times. And its leaders, again, this is before between 1199 and 1340, its leaders did not call themselves kings because they saw themselves as being dukes descended from the old Kievan nobility. And this was destroyed by the Mongols. And then when Ukraine reemerges, it is under Polish-Lithuanian domination. There was a time when Lithuania, which is today a rather small country, extended to Smolensk in Russia. It was a large empire. The Polish-Lithuanian Confederation embraced Ukraine until 1654, when there was a treaty signed with Russia, after which Ukraine became a principality of Russia for 300 years. So again, my point is you don't really have Poland as an independent state with a long, secure history. In 1917, in the disorder of the revolution, forces in Ukraine declared an independent state, anti-Bolshevik. This was overthrown, and there were fewer than 5 different Ukrainian states established within a short period of time with different borders. But finally, as of 1922, Ukraine was one of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And under it, for the first time, the region to the east of the Dnieper River becomes part of Ukraine. When you hear about West Ukraine, what's basically referred to as the area west of the Dnieper River. And that has historically been populated by Russian-speaking people. So that was the situation up until 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev, for reasons which are not clear, but probably have something to do with his own personal sentiment, because he was half Ukrainian and had been party boss in Ukraine for some years. He decided to gift the Crimean Peninsula from Russia to Ukraine. And the official explanation that I've read was that because the economies of Ukraine, or of Crimea and the surrounding parts of Ukraine were so thoroughly integrated that this just made sense. But of course, this comes back to haunt when in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. And people of Crimea actually petition at that time to be independent or to be integrated into Russia, and there are negotiations, but the matter falls through. But only for 70 years was Crimea part of Ukraine as a part of Russia. So finally, in 1991, Ukraine becomes independent, but under the control of the same kind of oligarchs who are grabbing large shares of the infrastructure, collectively constructed infrastructure at this time of collapse. This year of 1991, the year of the Gulf War, which occurs after Soviet, late in the game, Soviets attempt to prevent war, to persuade Saddam Hussein to withdraw his forces from Kuwait. He agrees to do so. That's the worst case scenario for the neocons in the State Department, because it would allow him to withdraw his troops and not have them destroyed, as in fact was the case in Operation Desert Storm. But this is a year demonstrating the ascendancy of the United States, the magnificence of the United States, just as the Soviet experiment seems to fizzle. The Warsaw Pact dissolves in February of that year, and in December, the Soviet Union dissolves. And who is in charge in Russia but President Boris Yeltsin, who turns out to be the rather dysfunctional Russian leader who is in power at the time that NATO is first deployed, ever, since its formation in 1949. Never really used in war during the Cold War, but in 1994 deployed to hit Serb targets, 300 Serb targets in Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, which had never been part of NATO or the Warsaw Pact. So that is the world in which today's Ukraine was born. And I think that's about all that I have time to say. Thank you.